The courtroom was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Judge Rebecca Lawson adjusted her glasses and glanced down at the file before her. Another trespassing case. Another homeless man caught sleeping where he shouldn't have been. She sighed. It was always the same story. The bailiff called the defendant's name. Robert Hayes. A man in tattered clothes and worn-out boots stepped forward. His face was weathered, lined with deep creases that spoke of years spent under the harsh sun and cold nights. His gray-streaked beard was unkempt, his hands rough and calloused. Judge Lawson barely looked at him as she read from the file. Mr. Hayes, you were found sleeping in the alley behind a downtown cafe, refusing to leave when asked by the owner. This is your third trespassing charge in the last 6 months. Do you have anything to say for yourself? The man lifted his head slowly. His eyes, tired, sunken, held a quiet dignity. He opened his mouth as if to speak but hesitated. Instead, he simply said, "I was just trying to stay warm, Your Honor." Lawson exhaled sharply. She had heard it all before. Another person who had fallen through the cracks. Another case that would end with a fine he couldn't pay or a short stint in jail that wouldn't change anything. But what she didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Robert Hayes was no ordinary homeless man. He was a veteran. And the truth about his past was about to change everything. Judge Lawson tapped her pen against the desk. Mr. Hayes, the law is clear. Private property is private property. The cafe owner had every right to ask you to leave. Instead, you stayed. Why? Robert Hayes swallowed hard. Didn't have anywhere else to go. The courtroom was silent. A few people in the back shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lawson sighed. That's not an excuse to break the law. Robert didn't argue. He stood there, hands clasped in front of him, shoulders slightly hunched. He had been in front of enough judges to know that nothing he said would change the outcome. "Do you have any family?" she asked. "No, ma'am." "A job?" Robert hesitated. "Not anymore." Lawson skimmed the file again. "Mr. Hayes, I see here that you were honorably discharged from the military." She glanced up, suddenly paying attention. "Is that correct?" Robert gave a slow nod. Her grip on the pen tightened. "When did you serve?" "First tour in Iraq, then Afghanistan." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor, who had looked bored a moment ago, sat up straighter. Lawson's expression softened, but only slightly. "And what happened after you got out?" Robert looked down. He didn't need to answer. The answer was written all over him. The judge exhaled, tapping her fingers against her desk. "So you fought for this country, but now you're sleeping in alleys?" Robert lifted his gaze. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet, steady truth. "Yes, ma'am." For the first time in years, Judge Lawson felt unsure. She was supposed to pass judgment, to follow the law, to issue a ruling and move on. But something about Robert Hayes made her pause. She looked at him, not just as another case, but as a man who had been forgotten. Lawson straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to ask you one last question." Robert braced himself. "If I dismiss these charges," she said slowly, "will you let me help you?" Robert blinked, his lips parting slightly, as if he hadn't expected kindness. as if he had forgotten what it felt like. The room was silent, waiting for his answer. Robert stood frozen, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Help me?" Judge Lawson nodded. "Yes, but only if you're willing to accept it." The courtroom remained silent, every eye fixed on Robert. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing around as if expecting someone to tell him this was a trick. He had been let down before. He had been promised help that never came. But there was something different about the way the judge looked at him. She wasn't pitying him. She wasn't judging him. She was offering something real. Robert cleared his throat. "What kind of help?" Lawson leaned forward slightly. "Housing, a rehabilitation program, maybe even job placement. There are organizations that specialize in helping veterans like you get back on their feet. If you're willing to work with them, I'm willing to make sure this case doesn't follow you." Robert hesitated. The last time someone had offered help, it had come with conditions he couldn't meet. But this was different. His voice caught in his throat. He wasn't used to asking for help. But maybe, just maybe, this was his chance. He looked up, meeting Lawson's eyes. "I want to try." A small smile touched the judge's lips. "Good." She turned to the prosecutor. "I'm recommending a dismissal on the condition that Mr. Hayes enrolls in a Veterans Assistance Program. Do you object?" The prosecutor, who had been flipping through his notes, sighed. "Not if he follows through." Lawson nodded, then looked back at Robert. "That means no more sleeping in alleys. No more arrests. You walk out of here today and you go straight to the program. Understood?" Robert swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She tapped her gavel lightly. "Case dismissed." A quiet murmur filled the room. Robert felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was mixed with something else. Hope. It had been a long time since he felt that. As he stepped away from the defendant's stand, a woman approached him. She was dressed in professional but practical clothing, her warm smile reassuring. "I'm Laura Simmons," she said, offering a hand. "I work with a veterans outreach program. Let's get you started." Robert hesitated before shaking her hand. It was the first step, the hardest step. But for the first time in years, he wasn't walking alone. And maybe, just maybe, he had finally found his way home. Robert followed Laura out of the courthouse, the crisp autumn air biting at his skin. He still couldn't believe what had just happened. A few hours ago, he had been nothing more than a nameless case in front of a judge. Now he was walking toward something unfamiliar, a second chance. Laura led him to a small nonprofit office just a few blocks away. Inside, the walls were decorated with photos of veterans, some smiling, some solemn, and all of them connected by the weight of their past service. "Have a seat," Laura said, motioning toward a chair. She handed him a cup of coffee, and for the first time in what felt like forever, someone was looking at him not with suspicion, but with respect. Robert took a sip and let the warmth spread through him. "So," Laura began, "tell me your story." Robert hesitated. His story wasn't an easy one to tell. He had enlisted right after high school, eager to serve, proud to wear the uniform. He had seen the best and worst of humanity in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then, when his service ended, he came home to a nothing. No support, no guidance, no way to process everything he had been through. The nightmares came first, then the drinking, then the slow unraveling of everything he had built. Lost my job, he muttered. Lost my place. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, he gestured vaguely. This is where I ended up. Laura listened carefully, nodding but not interrupting. When he finally fell silent, she said, "You're not alone, Robert. A lot of vets struggle when they come back. But the important thing is that you're here now, and you're willing to rebuild." He scoffed. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," she admitted. "But you fought for this country. Now it's time to fight for yourself." Robert looked down at his rough, calloused hands. Could he really do this? Could he start over? Before he could say anything, Laura slid a folder across the table. "Here's what I can offer you. A temporary place to stay, mental health resources, job training, but you have to commit to it. No half measures." Robert's fingers traced the edge of the folder. The weight of the choice settled over him. If he walked out now, nothing would change. But if he stayed, maybe, just maybe, he had a shot at something better. He took a deep breath and met Laura's eyes. "What do I need to do?" Laura smiled. "Let's get started." But outside, in the cold streets of the city, someone was watching. A man in a dark coat leaned against a lamppost, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He had seen Robert Hayes before, and he knew exactly who he was. He exhaled a slow stream of smoke and muttered under his breath, "Welcome back, soldier. Let's see if you're really ready to face what you left behind." The past wasn't finished with Robert Hayes. Not yet. Robert settled into the small but clean transitional housing unit Laura had arranged for him. The room was bare. Just a twin bed, a wooden dresser, and a small table. But to Robert, it was more than enough. It was a start. For the first time in years, he had a door that locked. A place to rest without fear of being told to move along. But that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep didn't come easily. The ghosts of his past were still with him. The sounds of gunfire, the sandstorms, the faces of men who never made it home. He squeezed his eyes shut and took a deep breath, one step at a time. The next morning, Laura picked him up early. "Hope you're ready," she said as he climbed into the car. "We're heading to a job placement center." Robert nodded, though he wasn't sure what kind of job a man like him could get. He had been trained for war, not for sitting behind a desk. The center was buzzing with activity. Other veterans filling out paperwork, counselors speaking in hushed tones. A man in a polo shirt approached them with a warm smile. "Robert Hayes." Robert nodded. "I'm Dan, career specialist. Let's see what we can do for you." They sat in a small office where Dan scanned his file. "You've got leadership skills, discipline, a strong work ethic. Have you considered security work?" Robert exhaled. It wasn't a bad idea. It was familiar territory. "Yeah, I could do that." Dan nodded. "I know a place looking for night security. Pays decent, flexible hours. Interested?" Robert hesitated. His instinct told him to say no, to resist change. But he had promised himself he would try. "Yeah," he said. "I'll take it." Dan smiled. "Good choice. Let's get you set up." Later that night, Robert walked through the quiet halls of the office building he had been assigned to protect. It was easy work, checking doors, making rounds, watching security cameras. But just past midnight, he caught something on one of the monitors. A figure in a dark coat, standing across the street, just outside the glow of the streetlights. Watching. Robert's chest tightened. He knew that stance, that stillness. Someone was tracking him. His past wasn't just haunting him in his dreams. It was here, and it wasn't going away. Robert stared at the security monitor, his pulse steady but his mind racing. The man in the dark coat stood motionless across the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. He wasn't just some random stranger. He knew Robert, and Robert knew him. He grabbed his radio but hesitated. Calling the police wouldn't help, not yet. He needed to know what this was about. With a deep breath, he stepped outside. The cool night air hit his skin as he walked across the parking lot, his boots echoing on the pavement. The man didn't move. He just watched. Robert stopped a few feet away. "You gonna keep standing there? Or are you gonna tell me what this is about?" The man exhaled a slow breath, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "Took you long enough, Hayes." Robert's stomach tightened. The voice, the posture, the scars that ran along the man's cheek, barely visible in the dim light. "Walker," Robert muttered. "Sergeant Daniel Walker. A ghost from his past." Walker smirked. "Figured you'd remember me." Robert took a step forward. "Last I heard, you were in Texas. What are you doing here?" Walker shrugged. "Heard you were back in the world. Thought I'd check in." Robert crossed his arms. "I doubt that." Walker chuckled, shaking his head. "Still sharp. That's good. 'Cause I've got a problem. And I think you're the only man who can help me fix it." Robert frowned. "What kind of problem?" Walker's smirk faded. "The kind that doesn't go away on its own." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "Some of the guys we served with, they didn't make it home in one piece. And I don't mean physically." Robert knew what he meant. The war never really ended for some soldiers. "There's a man I'm looking for," Walker continued. "An old friend turned dangerous. He's been hurting people. And I think he's here in this city." Robert stiffened. "You think I know where he is?" "No," Walker admitted. "But you've got instincts. You've got eyes. And more than that, you owe it to the men we lost to do something about this." Robert clenched his jaw. He had spent years trying to escape his past. Now it had found him. He could walk away. He could pretend this wasn't his fight. But deep down, he already knew the answer. He was going to help, because that's who he was. He let out a slow breath. "Tell me everything." Walker nodded. "Let's take a walk." As they disappeared into the night, Robert knew his journey wasn't over. It was just beginning.